Usually when we talk about a legal contract, there is this fundamental expectation of precision.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's supposed to be like engineering, You sign a commercial lease or you enter into a business partnership, and the terms are just right there in black and white.
Exactly. We like things to be visible and predictable.
Right. The lawyer just points to the page and says, like, there it is. Break this specific clause, and here is the exact penalty. Signed or not signed. It's clean, it's binary, and honestly, it's comforting.
It is. You know the rules of engagement before you even start.
But then you step into the world of modern family law, divorce proceedings, parental rights, and suddenly, that precision just entirely vanishes.
It completely evaporates, yeah.
The contract basically gets shredded.
Yeah.
And you are looking at a legal landscape that is just incredibly murky. And if you are ready to wade into those legal muddy waters with us today, do us a huge favor right off the bat. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, it really does help us out.
It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these incredibly deep, unfiltered explorations of the most fascinating and complex materials out there. Because today we are doing a deep dive into something highly specific, highly controversial, and undeniably gripping.
Oh, it is. It's intense.
We are reviewing an ultra-long, incisive, and fascinating ebook aimed directly at the men's rights activist community and red-pilled manosphere men.
And it is a massive, incredibly dense piece of work.
It really is. The book is called The Tangled Web: How the State Enslaves Men Through Divorce and Abortion, written by Conrad Riker and published in 2025. Now, we are going to break down the sheer scale of Riker's worldview today, but I want to tell you right now, if you want to read this field manual for yourself, and you are absolutely going to want to see these exact arguments and claims with your own eyes, you need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it.
Definitely. And we really need to set a firm baseline for you, the listener, before we dive into the deep end here. The mission of this deep dive is to explore Riker's intensive arguments regarding the history of our institutions. Specifically, we're going to unpack his central claim that these institutions, so family courts, the welfare state, academia, were systematically captured by feminists and cultural Marxists over the last several decades.
Yeah, and here is a crucial disclaimer from both of us before we get started. Because this material contains highly politically charged content, touching on everything from gender dynamics to abortion, left-wing politics, right-wing politics, government policy, our job today is not to endorse or validate these viewpoints.
Exactly. We're not taking sides at all.
Not at all. We are impartially reporting on the contents of the book. We are unpacking the original source material so that you can understand the exact arguments, the historical framing, and the data that are animating this specific, highly active corner of the manosphere.
Precisely. We are acting purely as your guides through the text. And to give you an overview of the core thesis right out of the gate, so you have a framework for everything we're about to discuss. Riker's central premise is that the state has completely weaponized marriage and family law.
Weaponized it?
Yeah. He argues that the system is no longer about justice, and it's certainly no longer about family preservation. Instead, he claims it has been turned into a literal plantation.
Well, a literal plantation, that is a heavy word to use.
He uses it very deliberately, too. In Riker's overarching metaphor, men are the mules doing the economic labor, ex-wives act as the overseers managing the extraction of that labor, and the state itself is the owner.
Skimming the profits, basically.
Right, skimming the profits off the top through administrative fees, federal matching funds, and, political power.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because starting with that plantation metaphor tells us he is not pulling any punches whatsoever. The book kicks off by completely dismantling what he calls the marriage contract myth.
Yeah, chapter 1, basically.
Right. He essentially argues that marriage is no longer a contract in any traditional legal sense of the word.
Well, if we look at traditional contract law, you can't have a contract where one party can dissolve the agreement at any time for any reason while still retaining all the financial benefits of the contract.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like any contract I've ever signed.
Exactly. And simultaneously imposing massive, indefinite financial penalties on the other party who didn't even want to break the contract in the first place.
Right.
Riker calls modern marriage a state-run trapdoor into financial and spiritual slavery.
So if you are listening to this and thinking, well, how did we get from traditional marriage vows to a state-run trapdoor? Riker actually traces this back to a very specific turning point in American legal history, doesn't he?
He does. He points specifically to the California Family Law Act, which was passed in 1969 and went into full effect in the early 1970s, around 1973.
Okay.
This legislation was a massive paradigm shift because it ushered in the era of no-fault divorce.
No, wait. Let's take a step back here because I want to make sure the listener understands the mechanics of this. Before no-fault divorce, how did the system actually work? Like, why was this such a radical shift?
Before 1969, if you wanted a divorce, you had to prove to a judge that your spouse had committed a specific legal wrong. You had to prove fault.
Like adultery or something.
Right. Adultery, physical abuse, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. It was an adversarial process.
Yeah.
You couldn't just say, we grew apart.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly.
No. And because you had to prove a fault, there was a built-in friction to getting a divorce.
Yeah.
The state's underlying philosophy was that marriage was a bedrock institution, and they weren't going to let you dismantle it without a legally valid reason.
Okay, so the state acted as a gatekeeper. But what was the intended goal of introducing no-fault divorce then? I assume lawmakers didn't wake up one day and say, hey, let's destroy the family?
Not at all. I mean, the intent of the reformers was actually to reduce the toxicity of divorce, because couples who just wanted to separate amicably were being forced into court to essentially commit perjury.
Wait, really? Perjury?
Yeah, they would have to invent stories of abuse or stage fake adultery scenes with hired photographers just to satisfy the legal requirement for fault.
Oh, wow. That's wild.
So lawmakers thought, let's make this cleaner. Let's allow people to part ways due to irreconcilable differences without having to drag each other through the mud.
So the intent was harm reduction. But Riker focuses entirely on the outcome, and he uses this incredibly vivid story of a guy named Joe Carter to illustrate this.
Right, the San Diego mechanic.
Yeah, Joe was a mechanic in San Diego back in 1973. He'd been married for 15 years, worked long hours, provided for his family, and under the shiny new California law, his wife files for divorce. And Riker emphasizes that there was no adultery, no abuse, nothing like that. She just went into court and essentially said, I'm bored.
And under no-fault divorce, her boredom, or her simply feeling unfulfilled, is entirely legally sufficient to dissolve the legal partnership.
Exactly, and the outcome for Joe Carter. He loses his house, he loses primary custody of his kids, he loses his dog, and he instantly loses 40% of his paycheck to alimony and child support. Just like that.
Yep.
Riker frames this as an absolute erasure of a 15-year partnership where the assets are just forcefully redistributed by a judge regardless of who broke the contract.
And Riker backs up Joe Carter's anecdotal experience with some pretty stark macroeconomic data from that era. He points to U.S. Census reports showing that by 1980, so just a decade into this new legal framework, spreading across the countrymen's post-divorce income nosedived by 10 to 40% on average.
Wow.
Meanwhile, ex-wives' earnings jumped by 30%.
I need to pause you there, though. Because if a woman was previously a stay-at-home mother and then gets divorced, isn't that 30% jump just a natural economic rebalancing of her entering the workforce or getting access to half the marital assets?
That is exactly how mainstream sociologists interpret it. But Riker interprets this data very differently. He describes this not as a natural rebalancing, but as a Marxist yard sale.
A Marxist yard sale.
Yeah. He argues that feminist groups at the time cheered this massive systematic wealth transfer as liberation, while the men experiencing it viewed it as state-sanctioned theft. Riker's framing is that the state essentially empowered one demographic to legally loot the accumulated wealth of another.
So Riker is essentially arguing that no-fault divorce was the Trojan horse for state-sanctioned theft. It's funny because looking at the triple divorce rate in the text, I've got to use Riker's analogy here. He says saying no-fault divorce didn't cause the destruction of the nuclear family is like blaming raincoats for hurricanes.
That's the exact analogy he uses, yeah.
Just totally ignoring the obvious catalyst.
And he has a very specific view of how this happened. Riker argues this wasn't just an accident of bad, well-intentioned legislation. He believes this was engineered. And this is where he brings in Antonio Gramsci and the concept of cultural Marxism.
Okay, I see the term cultural Marxism thrown around on the internet constantly, often just as a buzzword. Break down how Riker actually defines it and applies it to family law here, because we really need to explain the mechanics of this theory.
To understand Riker's argument, we have to look at who Antonio Gramsci was. He was an Italian Marxist philosopher who was imprisoned by Mussolini in the 1920s.
Okay.
While in prison, Gramsci wrote what became known as the prison notebooks. He was trying to figure out why the Marxist revolutions that happened in Russia weren't organically happening in Western capitalist democracies like Italy or Britain.
Why wasn't the working class rising up, basically?
Exactly. And Gramsci's conclusion was a concept he called cultural hegemony. He argued that you couldn't just overthrow a capitalist state through violent economic revolution because the ruling class maintains control not just through force, but through culture.
Oh, I see.
They control the churches, the schools, the media, and the courts. These institutions shape what the average person considers common sense.
So if you want to change the society, you have to capture the institutions that define reality for people. You have to change the culture before you can change the economics.
Yes. And Riker claims that in the mid-20th century, modern Marxists realized they couldn't overthrow American capitalism directly. The American middle class was too wealthy and, too comfortable.
Right.
So according to Riker, they pivoted. If they couldn't attack capitalism, they would attack the foundational unit that produced capitalist stability,
Right.
the nuclear family, and the patriarchy. And they did this by infiltrating academia and the family courts.
Give me an example of how he substantiates that leap. Because claiming a coordinated infiltration of the courts is a massive accusation.
Riker points to the rise of highly influential feminist legal scholars in the 1970s and 80s. He specifically singles out Catherine McKinnon. She is a highly prominent legal scholar who fundamentally reshaped sexual harassment law and anti-pornography ordinances in the U.S.
Okay, I've heard that name.
Right. Well, Riker points to a specific piece of her writing from 1987 where she claimed that male parenting is institutionalized violence.
Wait, institutionalized violence, what does that even mean in the context of a father raising a child?
In the radical feminist framework Riker is critiquing, the argument is that the traditional patriarchal family structure is inherently oppressive to women and children, and that a father's authority is a form of systemic violence, regardless of whether he is physically abusive or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Riker argues that this specific academic theory didn't just stay in university libraries. He says it became the operational doctrine of the entire family court system.
So you have a legal system that starts viewing fathers not as equal parents, but as potential inherent threats simply by virtue of being men.
That is Riker's exact conclusion. He cites a 2019 Journal of Family Psychology statistic claiming that 80% of modern custody evaluators, the psychological experts the courts rely on to determine who gets the kids, are trained in feminist trauma-informed methods.
So if I'm understanding Riker's logic, the deck is completely stacked against the father before he even walks through the courtroom doors. Like, the expert evaluating him has been academically trained to view his presence as a negative?
According to Riker, absolutely. He provides an anecdote about seeing a custody evaluation form in Florida where the father's score section had a pre-filled minus 10 points.
Wait, what?
Yeah, simply for the line item. Y chromosome present?
You're kidding? A literal negative score just for being biologically male.
Riker says the court evaluator brushed it off, claiming it was just an internal office joke or satire. But Riker points out that the joke always seems to end with the dad paying 40% of his income for supervised weekend visits. The underlying bias, he argues, is real and structural.
Okay, so if the divorce court is the trap door, as Riker says, the welfare state is the engine pulling the lever, which moves the conversation to Riker's critique of government incentives, right?
Yes, and this is a really fascinating economic argument. He spends a lot of time dissecting the mechanics of what he calls a predatory mating ritual.
A predatory mating ritual.
Yeah. He specifically looks at the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, which was famously championed and signed by President Bill Clinton. The official name of the bill was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And Riker finds that name to be deeply, darkly ironic.
Because he jokes that whoever named it deserves a Pulitzer Prize for political comedy, right?
Exactly. Because Riker argues it didn't promote personal responsibility at all. He claims it fundamentally bankrolled irresponsibility.
I need you to break down the mechanics of this, because the 1996 welfare reform was famously lauded by conservatives at the time for instituting work requirements and time limits. So how does Riker arrive at the conclusion that it incentivized broken homes?
Riker argues that while it did put time limits on certain federal cash assistance, it fundamentally changed how states administer welfare through block grants. And more importantly, he argues that the overarching structure of the social safety net housing assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, child care subsidies created a massive loophole for clever divorce attorneys and single mothers.
What's the loophole?
The benefit cliffs. If a woman is married to a man who makes a lower middle class wage, their combined household income likely disqualifies them from most federal and state assistance programs.
Right.
But if she divorces him, kicks him out of the house, and takes custody of the kids, her household income plummets on paper.
And suddenly she qualifies for housing vouchers, SNAP benefits, state-funded health care, and utility assistance.
Exactly. Riker claims that the government actually pays a better overall dividend in services and cash equivalent benefits if you ensure you are not legally tied to the father of your children.
That's crazy to think about.
He cites researchers from the Brookings Institution in 2001 who conducted a massive study on welfare spending. They found a direct mathematical correlation. Every single dollar spent on welfare correlated with a 2% spike in the divorce rate in that demographic.
Give me a second to wrap my head around that. Every dollar pumped into the welfare system bumped the divorce rate by 2%.
That is the data Riker presents. He uses it to conclude that governments essentially morphed into institutional racketeers. The state creates a financial incentive to break up the home.
Unbelievable.
Once the home is broken, they skim the court fees during the divorce, the lawyers get paid, the ex-wives get the welfare benefits, and the man's marriage license essentially just becomes a receipt for his future financial enslavement.
And he takes this critique of the welfare state into even darker territory when he discusses what he coined as the Rovember effect. This section of the book was absolutely staggering to read, and honestly, it felt like a massive inferential leap. I want you to explain the mechanics of the Rovember effect to the listener.
It is arguably one of his most controversial chapters.
What?
Riker analyzed the administrative cycles of SNP, what we historically call food stamps, and EBT recertification.
Okay, so the process where a recipient has to prove they still have low enough income to keep getting benefits.
Right. It happens cyclically, often late in the year. Riker claims that, statistically, abortions spike by 23% every November, right when these EBT benefits are being reviewed and renewed.
Wait, is he actually suggesting that women are sinking their reproductive choices in pregnancies with federal bureaucratic cycles? That sounds like a wild leap from correlation to causation.
Riker argues it is a direct, cold-blooded financial calculus. He claims that some women use pregnancy as a tool to navigate the welfare system. If benefits are at risk of being cut, a pregnancy can change the math. Furthermore, he makes the explosive claim that some women deliberately delay getting abortions until past the 20-week mark.
Why would they do that? That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Because, under certain state bureaucratic rules, a late-term pregnancy gets classified as a high-risk pregnancy, and a high-risk medical status can automatically qualify an applicant for emergency, higher-tier SNP benefits much faster, bypassing the usual waiting periods.
Oh my God.
Once the elevated benefits are secured, he claims, they then terminate the pregnancy.
That is treating pregnancy and abortion purely as a financial optimization strategy. It's incredibly cynical. He even mentions Baltimore having an abortion access and EBT enrollment mobile unit that circles public housing projects on the first of the month, doing both at the exact same time.
Yeah.
He calls it modern efficiency at its finest, but obviously he means that with dripping, bitter sarcasm.
Through Riker's lens, this is a state-sponsored shakedown. He argues that men's taxes are forcibly extracted to fund the bureaucratic machinery that allows women to optimize the elimination of men's own potential offspring.
And on the flip side of abortion, you have the absolute weaponization of child support when the child was born.
Yeah.
Riker brings up a famous Chicago Tribune expose from 2014 to highlight how this system is gamed.
Yes. The Tribune profiled a 43-year-old woman who had literally transformed the family court system into a personal enterprise. She had 6 different children by 6 different fathers. Through the courts, she converted those 6 men into a guaranteed $1,800 a month in tax-free child support. On top of that, because she was a single mother of 6, she was collecting an additional $4,200 a month in Section 8 housing benefits and other state aid.
So she is bringing in roughly $6,000 a month, equivalent to a $72,000 a year salary, entirely tax-free just by having children with different men and letting the state extract the funds. And Riker traces the historical lineage of this exact scenario all the way back to 1911, right? How does he connect a woman in Chicago in 2014 to a law from 1911?
He points to the first mother's pension law, which was enacted in Missouri in 1911. This was the very beginning of state-sponsored welfare for single mothers. But back then, there were massive moral guardrails.
Right.
If a widow wanted state help, she had to have her neighbors testify in court to her upstanding moral character. The state would not fund you if your situation was due to your own reckless behavior.
So how did we lose those guardrails?
Riker points to the 1960s and the Cloward-Piven strategy. This is another major academic framework he believes was weaponized. Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven were sociologists at Columbia University who wrote a highly influential paper in 1966.
Okay, explain the mechanics of Cloward-Piven, because again, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot without explanation. What did they actually propose?
Cloward and Piven observed that millions of Americans were technically eligible for welfare, but weren't enrolled, Largely due to the stigma and the bureaucratic guardrails we just talked about, their strategy was to deliberately overload the welfare bureaucracy.
Overload it.
Yeah. They wanted activists to sign up every single eligible person all at once. The goal was to cause a massive systemic financial crisis at the local and state levels, bankrupting the welfare offices.
Why would they want to bankrupt the system helping the poor?
Because they believed that out of that engineered crisis, the federal government would be forced to step in and implement a guaranteed national minimum income. They wanted to force a socialist economic restructuring through bureaucratic sabotage.
Wow, and Riker maps this onto the family courts.
He argues that the systematic removal of moral guardrails from welfare and divorce was an intentional application of this strategy. The goal was to make dependence on the state as easy and frictionless as possible. The safety net evolved into what he calls a hammock.
He literally says the state acts as a pimp. That's his word.
Yeah, a pimp skimming a cut.
The government plays the role of the sugar daddy, the women are relegated to the role of broodmares, and the men are reduced to indentured servants whose wages are garnished. And the state takes its cut in administrative fees while simultaneously lecturing those same men about toxic masculinity.
It creates a vicious cycle.
Which begs the question, what does this all mean for the concept of traditional fatherhood if, as Riker claims, the state actively pays women to avoid marriage?
It fundamentally penalizes it. He points to data on the non-citizen child supplemental program and cites Harvard longitudinal studies showing that children raised in single-mother households are suspended from school 2.7 times more often. They are dramatically more likely to end up in prison and have higher rates of depression.
So the state knows the data. The state knows that incentivizing fatherless homes produces worse outcomes for the children.
Riker argues the state is fully aware it is funding a broken, sociologically destructive model, but he claims the state continues to aggressively fund it anyway because broken homes generate a massive dependent voting bloc and justify endless bureaucratic budgets and revenue streams.
Which transitions us seamlessly and tragically into one of the most enraging parts of the book for his audience. If the system is extracting this much money from men, what happens when the underlying biology is a lie? This brings us to what Riker calls the epidemic of paternity fraud and the biology of extortion.
This is where Riker argues the legal system's absolute indifference to biological reality and its focus purely on financial extraction becomes incredibly stark.
I want to talk about the story of John R., because this is every man's worst nightmare. John was a mechanic in Detroit. He was paying $1,200 a month in child support for twin boys. And he wasn't a deadbeat. He was coaching their little league team, buying them gear, totally and completely emotionally invested as their father.
Right.
And then, when the kids turn 12 years old, something happens that prompts a medical issue, and they take DNA tests. And the tests prove, unequivocally, with 99.9% scientific certainty, that John is not their biological father. His ex-wife had an affair.
Now, a rational observer looking at that from the perspective of standard contract law might think, well, okay, the contract is null and void.
Right.
The entire premise of the child support order was based on a fundamental fraud. The payments should stop immediately, and maybe he should even be reimbursed.
If I sell you a car and it turns out to be stolen, the contract is void. But Riker points out the terrifying legal reality of family court. In 43 different states in the U.S., men must still pay child support even after DNA conclusively proves they are not the biological father.
43 states. It is an overwhelming majority of the country.
If you're listening to this and wondering, how on earth is that legally justified? I had the exact same thought. Once the state tags you with that financial burden, you are stuck.
He talks about another dad in Michigan who proved he wasn't the father. In court, his ex-wife openly admitted to sabotaging her birth control and sleeping with another man, and the state of Michigan still hit him with an $18,000 arrears bill. How can a judge look at a DNA test and say, I don't care, pay the money? This raises a massive question about institutional incentives, and Riker has a very specific structural answer. He points directly to Title V VD of the Social Security Act.
Okay, let's slow down here. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics and the math of Title V VD. What is this program?
Title V VD is a federal program that was designed to help states enforce child support orders. But the way it functions is by paying states a massive financial bounty. The federal government pays states up to $4.6 billion annually to maximize the amount of child support they order and collect.
So the state is essentially operating like a bounty hunter working on commission.
Exactly. Riker explains the math. Title IVD creates a 66% federal match on every dollar the state extracts from men's wallets and processes through their system.
Wait, let me make sure I've got this right. If a family court judge in Michigan forces that dad to pay $1,000 in child support, the federal government looks at that ledger and gives the state of Michigan an additional $660 in federal matching funds.
Yes. That money goes into the state's general coffers or funds their social service bureaucracies. So, from Riker's perspective, the state government doesn't care about the DNA. It doesn't care about the moral truth, the husband's betrayal, or the biological reality. It cares strictly about the revenue stream.
That's sickening.
The family court isn't a hall of justice. It is a profit center for the state budget.
That is absolutely dystopian. It's like a sci-fi movie. You're getting taxed by the government for sperm you haven't even ejaculated yet, or in this case, sperm that belongs to another man entirely. And the legal system aggressively protects this revenue stream. Riker cites a Cornell law review finding that courts deny 92% of paternity challenges if the mother simply claims emotional distress at the prospect of the child losing their presumed father. So the scientific truth doesn't matter. The mother's feelings and the state's budget trump the man's biological reality and his entire financial future.
And the toll this takes on these men is not just financial. Riker has actually tried to quantify the physical and biological damage this system inflicts. He introduces a metric his research team developed called the Sperm Slavery Index.
Explain this index, because when I read this, I was stunned.
They analyzed global demographic and health data and found an incredibly dark correlation. They discovered that countries with the most aggressive, highest alimony and child support payment structures correspond directly to male lifespans being reduced.
Reduced lifespan.
Yes. Specifically, in the most extractive systems, male lifespans are 11.3 years shorter on average compared to baseline metrics. He connects this unending financial extraction directly to accelerated physical deterioration.
How does money leaving your bank account translate to your body physically breaking down?
Stress physiology. He cites a 2022 National Institutes of Health study looking at endocrinology. The study showed that men who are under chronic, unyielding child support, stress meaning the constant threat of jail, the inability to pay bills, the constant court dates, average 40% lower sperm counts.
Because their bodies are just marinating in stress hormones.
Exactly. The chronic cortisol levels literally nuke their testosterone production. It shuts down their reproductive biology. Riker points out that researchers at Johns Hopkins found that fathers who are averaging only 4.6 hours of sleep a night because of brutal custody battles and financial panic share the exact same cortisol profiles as Vietnam prisoners of war.
That is horrifying. You are chemically castrating men through administrative stress while the state holds a press conference pretending to care about family values.
And if the paternity fraud section was about the biological toll, it begs the question, how are these men physically surviving the drain on their wallets? Which brings us to Riker's exploration of the absolute financial ruin men face, what he calls the alimony racket, debt peonage, and the daddy diet.
Right. Let's look at the sheer scale of the money involved. Riker points out that total American child support debt currently sits at $114 billion.
To put that $114 billion into perspective, Riker notes that you could buy the entire Twitter platform twice. You could fund NASA's entire space exploration budget for 6 straight years, or you could literally buy a vasectomy and a steak dinner for every single adult man in the United States.
But instead of going to space, that money represents a modern debtor's prison. I want to talk about Dave, the trucker from Ohio, because this perfectly encapsulates the madness of the bureaucracy.
Dave's story is Riker's prime example of how the system actively criminalizes poverty and sets men up to fail. Dave was hit with a $1,200 a month child support payment, which constituted over half of his actual take-home pay.
Oh.
Yeah. During the COVID lockdowns, the freight industry dried up. Dave wasn't getting rotes, his income plummeted, and he missed 3 payments.
And what happened? Did the court look at the global pandemic and work with him? No. The courts moved to revoke his commercial driver's license.
Which is the exact license he requires to make his living and pay the debt.
Exactly. It's completely insanely counterintuitive. The state says, we want you to pay us this money, and because you are struggling to pay it, we're going to make it legally impossible for you to earn money. It is a bureaucratic trap. Because he couldn't drive, he went into deeper arrears, and he was thrown in county jail 14 separate times for contempt of court. He ultimately ended up homeless, living in a 1997 Ford Econoline van, his credit score ruined, completely unable to breathe financially.
And if we look at the underlying logic of how a judge justifies throwing a man in a cage for a debt, we have to understand the legal mechanism of contempt. You aren't technically going to jail because you are poor. You are going to jail because the judge ordered you to pay, and you failed to comply with the judge's order.
Right, a technicality.
It is a subtle but devastating legal distinction that allows the U.S. to maintain debtors' prisons, despite them technically being unconstitutional.
And Riker draws a direct historical parallel here that is really striking. He compares this modern system directly to medieval serfdom.
Yes, he points out that during the feudal era, a serf who worked the land was required to give the lord of the manor roughly 30% of their harvest. These were called villein dues.
And what are the dues today? Riker points out that under laws like California's Family Code Section 4722, men are routinely forced to forfeit 25 to 65% of their net paychecks. He argues that the modern family court system is actually mathematically more extractive than the medieval lords were to their serfs.
And he backs this up by pointing to the existence of literal modern-day debtors' plantations. He spends time analyzing Angola Farm in Louisiana.
Oh, this part was wild.
It is a massive state penitentiary that operates as a working farm. Riker notes that there are men there on parole who couldn't keep up with their massive child support arrearages, who were literally put into the fields to pick cotton to pay off the state debt.
Picking cotton for the state to pay off a family court debt, it's almost too on the nose.
The warden of the facility calls it a rehabilitation and work release program. Riker calls it swapping 19th century iron shackles for 21st century GPS ankle monitors. He views it as an incarceration industrial complex that actively feeds off the bodies of divorced men.
And for the men trapped in this who are facing jail time, who have lost their kids, who are giving up 65% of their income, the mental toll is catastrophic. We have to talk about the Harvard 2022 longitudinal study that Riker cites regarding mortality. It states that men who are saddled with insurmountable child support debt are 300% more likely to commit suicide. 300%.
Riker aggressively forces the reader to look at what he calls the blood-stained ledger of the family courts. He recounts the story of John Mercer, a father who, after a judge demanded 65% of his income, walked out of the courthouse, wrote a note that said, "Better a bullet than another custody hearing," and took his own life.
God.
Riker is adamant that we must stop classifying these deaths as mysterious spikes in clinical male depression. He argues this is the logical, court-approved dismantling of their existence. When you back an animal into a corner and take everything it has, it destroys itself.
And for the men who don't choose suicide, they choose slow starvation. Riker introduces this grim phenomenon he calls the daddy diet. He brings up Greg Miller, a dad from Texas who went viral online for posting a picture of his daily meal. He called it his post-divorce sushi.
Which was literally just a can of cheap tuna fish mixed with ketchup packets that he had stolen from a Chevron gas station.
Because he couldn't afford groceries after the state garnished his wages.
And it's not an isolated incident. Riker pulls data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showing that single men's food expenditures dropped by a staggering 22% post-divorce. They are literally rationing their caloric intake to pay the state's ransom.
It's an absolutely bleak picture. But Riker argues that the oppression isn't just financial. When men try to fight back, or even when young men just try to exist and navigate modern spaces, they are subjected to systemic mental health gaslighting and what he refers to as the false rape industry. This takes us into a totally different institutional arena.
Right. Here, Riker shifts his analytical focus away from the family courts and directs it toward the American university system and the fields of psychology. He believes that the state actively weaponizes campus administrative law, specifically Title IX, to condition young men to accept a presumption of guilt.
He starts this section with the infamous Mattress Girls saga at Columbia University. For those who don't remember, a student named Emma Sulkovich carried a dorm mattress around the campus for an entire year. She claimed she was raped by a male student, and the mattress was a performance art protest.
But Riker highlights the details of the investigation. Despite her claims, there was no police report filed at the time of the incident, and according to Riker's review of the university's own findings, there was zero actionable evidence.
Zero.
Yet the university administration allowed the protest. She was invited to the State of the Union address. Columbia gave her a standing ovation at graduation, and the accused male student was essentially branded with a scarlet letter and had his life ruined by the mob, despite being cleared by the university's own weak standards.
So how did universities become kangaroo courts? Riker traces the explosion of this toxic campus environment directly to a specific policy directive, Barack Obama's 2011 Dear Colleague letter.
This is a critical piece of administrative history. In 2011, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights sent a letter to every university receiving federal funds. The letter mandated that universities change the evidentiary standard they use in campus sexual assault tribunals.
Change it to what?
They forced them to move from a clear and convincing evidence standard down to a preponderance of the evidence standard.
Let's explain that legal jargon, because the distinction is everything here.
Clear and convincing means you are highly confident the accused did it. Preponderance of the evidence simply means it is 51% likely. It means more likely than not.
Basically a coin toss.
Legal scholars across the political spectrum heavily criticize this, calling it exactly that, a coin flip. If the tribunal thinks there's a 51% chance you did it, you are expelled, your academic career is over, and you carry the stigma of a predator.
And the administrative result of this letter, Title IX offices at universities ballooned by 300% almost overnight. They became massive bureaucracies.
And what's fascinating here is how Riker breaks down the economics of these accusations. He points out that universities are now spending an estimated $2.4 billion annually fighting and settling Title IX lawsuits, often lawsuits brought by the wrongfully accused men whose due process rights were violated.
But the universities don't eat that cost from their endowments, do they?
No, not at all. Riker shows how they roll those massive legal liabilities directly into 5% annual tuition hikes. So the entire student body, including the men, are taking out federal student loans to fund the very kangaroo courts that are prosecuting them.
Oh, that's insidious.
Riker argues the goal of these Title IX offices isn't justice or safety at all. It's administrative bloat, job security for bureaucrats, and institutional fundraising driven by perpetual moral panic.
And Riker argues this assumption of male guilt, this 51% standard, extends far beyond the college campus and into adult domestic violence policy. He looks closely at the Violence Against Women Act, VOOA, and specifically attacks the underlying philosophy of the Duluth model of domestic violence intervention.
The Duluth model is the standard operational procedure for most police departments in the U.S. when responding to a domestic dispute.
What is the underlying philosophy of the model?
The Duluth model was created by feminist sociologists in Minnesota in the 1980s. Its core philosophical tenet is that domestic violence is not caused by psychological issues, substance abuse, or relationship dynamics, but purely by patriarchal conditioning.
Patriarchal conditioning.
Yes. It assumes that in any domestic dispute, the man is utilizing what they call patriarchal terrorism to control the woman.
So it pre-assigns the roles of abuser and victim based entirely on gender, before the cops even pull up to the house.
Exactly. Riker points out the devastating circular logic this creates. Under mandatory arrest policies driven by the Duluth model, police end up arresting the man in 86% of cases where both parties are equally engaged in mutual combat.
Wow.
The man gets a criminal record, which destroys his earning potential, which leads to a divorce. The divorce creates another single mother who then needs state aid, and then the state taxes the newly criminalized divorced father to fund the aid.
It is a perfectly closed loop of extraction, but the most alarming and frankly bizarre detail he pulls regarding VOOA-funded programs is from a UCLA study regarding court-mandated therapy sessions. This absolutely blew my mind.
It sounds like science fiction, but it is real, peer-reviewed research. Researchers looked at state-funded counseling sessions for women involved in domestic disputes. During these sessions, some women were administered oxytocin nasal sprays.
Oxytocin is the love hormone, right? The chemical that promotes maternal bonding and social connection.
Correct. The researchers thought it might help the women heal from trauma and open up in therapy. But what they found was that administering the oxytocin actually increased the rate of verifiable false accusations against their male partners by 22%.
Wait, giving them a bonding hormone made them lie more about being abused. How does that work?
The theory is that oxytocin increases in-group bonding, but also increases hostility and defensive fabrication against out-group threats. If the therapist is validating their victimhood, the oxytocin makes them bond with the therapist and exaggerate or invent claims to solidify that bond and punish the man.
I can't even process that.
Riker jokes, grimly, that the state is literally funding therapy that uses hormones to enhance creative storytelling to put men in jail.
It's like finding the wallet of the guy who just mugged you, and the city charging you a handling fee to return it to him. So if you took all of this together, the Title IX kangaroo courts, the 51% standard of guilt, the Duluth model prejudging you, the literal hormonal enhancement of false accusations, and the financial ruin of family court, Riker points out a massive sociological shift.
Yeah, the total collapse of trust.
He cites a recent Pew Research stat. 78% of Gen Z men reported they would rather share their entire unfiltered internet browser history publicly than risk being completely alone in a professional setting with a woman they don't know well, out of fear of a false accusation.
Let that sink in. A young man would rather you see his most embarrassing private internet searches than sit in a room with a female colleague with the door closed. The fundamental trust between the sexes has been entirely hollowed out.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the trust is gone, how does Riker say men are adapting? Because his audience, the red-pilled manosphere, they aren't just rolling over and accepting this, they are building countermeasures. Which brings us to the final major section of the book, the resistance. He titles this section Digital Serfdom, Visas, and Vasectomies.
Riker spends the last third of his book pivoting from a systemic critique into essentially acting as a tactical guide. He documents what he describes as an actual functioning underground railroad of men who are actively fleeing the system.
He cites an investigation by the Daily Wire that tracked 4,700 American fathers who have literally packed up and fled across the border to Mexico since 2015, specifically to escape the jurisdiction of the U.S. family court system.
They're becoming expats purely to avoid debtor's prison. And for the men who stay, they're creating shadow communities. Riker talks about the Garage Guild movement in Houston.
Explain the garage guilds, because this shows how deep the micro-policing goes.
Men in Houston were building these underground, informal workshop spaces, basically advanced man caves in massive garages where guys could work on cars, play poker, and just exist away from their families and the culture. But local zoning boards started cracking down on them, sending inspectors to shut them down, labeling a group of men playing poker as a public nuisance.
While at the same time, Riker notes, the city allowed female-owned wellness cooperatives and yoga studios to operate in the exact same residential zoning areas without a peep from the inspectors. So the men are taking their spaces completely underground, blacking out the windows, running them like speakeasies.
And they aren't just hiding their physical bodies, they're hiding their assets. This is where Riker dives into the code is law mentality of the crypto bros.
Right, if the family court judge can subpoena your Bank of America account and drain it to pay Title IV VD fees, how do you stop them? You move the money where the judge can't see it.
Riker mentions Elon Musk's reported 2023 prenuptial agreement, which allegedly utilized Dogecoin and smart contracts. But for the average guy, they are using privacy coins like Monero, which are virtually untraceable, and stable coins.
And how do they secure it? I mean, a judge can just demand your passwords.
They engrave their crypto seed phrases, the 12 or 24 word master passwords to their digital wallets, onto metal dog tags, or they memorize them. They are creating a financial firewall.
Wow.
If the judge says, "Give us your money," the man can simply say, "I lost the USB drive in a boating accident," and the state has zero technical ability to confiscate the wealth.
It's a technological checkmate against the state, and the state is terrified of this, which is why they are turning to what Riker calls digital serfdom to track these men. He points out a terrifying statistic. Raytheon, the massive military defense contractor that builds missiles, also manufactures GPS ankle monitors. And those monitors are currently worn by 412,000 American fathers every single day.
They took the exact same tracking technology used for paroled felons and juvenile delinquents, and they applied it to dads who fell behind on child support. It is the full weight of the carceral surveillance state applied to fatherhood.
Riker tells the story of a dad in Birmingham who had one of these monitors. The dad went to a peaceful public protest against the ankle monitor system, and because the monitor tracked his GPS coordinates entering a specific geofenced zone near the courthouse, it pinged the authorities, and he was arrested for violating the terms of his movement restrictions.
So how do you fight a defense contractor like Raytheon, tracking your every move?
Right.
Riker says men are adopting electronic warfare tactics.
Literally, he details men buying or building Faraday cages for their glove compartments.
For listeners who don't know, a Faraday cage is an enclosure made of conductive mesh that blocks electromagnetic fields and radio frequencies.
Right.
If you put a tracking device or a phone in a Faraday cage, it completely severs its connection to the GPS satellites and cell towers.
He also talks about men using Raspberry Pi microcomputers. They program these tiny $34 devices to act as GPS spoofers. A guy will leave the spoofer plugged in on his living room couch, broadcasting a fake signal to the police saying he is sitting at home watching TV, while he is actually 2 towns over working a cash under the table job so the state can't garnish his wages. It is massive, coordinated civil disobedience.
And that profound disobedience extends to how these men are choosing to raise the children they do still have access to. Riker explores the rapidly growing homeschooling underground.
This is a major point of conflict. Riker points out that Child Protective Services, CPS, targets single fathers at vastly disproportionate rates. He claims 68% of CPS investigations in certain counties are aimed at single dads.
He cites leaked FBI memos that internally labeled certain radical homeschooling parents as domestic extremists. Why? Because instead of sending their kids to public schools to learn TikTok trends, critical theory, and infinite gender pronouns, these fathers are pulling them out of the system entirely to teach them calculus, classical mechanics, and the philosophy of John Locke.
Riker traveled to meet a co-op of fathers in Montana who are living completely off-grid. They're teaching their kids how to field dress a deer for food, how to purify water, and essentially how to avoid the state surveillance drones. It is a total, uncompromising secession from modern state institutions.
But the ultimate form of secession, according to Riker's framework, isn't financial or educational, it is biological. And this brings us to what he calls the vasectomy renaissance.
This was the most intense part of the whole book. Men are literally treating surgical sterilization as a form of tactical warfare against the state.
He cites underground Reddit communities and manosphere forums where men maintain heavily encrypted, constantly updated lists of specific urologists and doctors who are willing to perform vasectomies for cash.
Just off the books.
Yep. Zero questions asked and zero paperwork filed with insurance companies.
Riker says these men treat the clinic like a dead drop. They buy temporary burner phones at a gas station just to make the appointment. They walk into the clinic, hand over a stack of untraceable cash, and when handed the medical forms, they just claim they don't have ID or can't deal with forms. They get the surgery and vanish.
Riker frames this as a literal reproductive strike. His logic is cold, but consistent with his worldview. If the state has legally decided that your sperm is a taxable asset, an asset that can be used to enslave you for 18 to 20 years, seize your passport, and put you in a cage, the most logical, strategic defense is to permanently take that asset off the board. You deny the state its raw material.
And for the men who do still want to have a traditional family, who want children but refuse to play Russian roulette with American family courts, they are completely abandoning the country. This is the rise of the passport bros. Forbes magazine actually tracked a 300% spike in the use of offshore marriage brokers by American men since 2015.
Riker defends this practice incredibly aggressively against mainstream criticism. He notes that feminist think tanks and media outlets constantly decry passport bros as engaging in neocolonialism, accusing them of going overseas to exploit poor, subservient women who don't know any better.
But Riker looks at the data and says that is a complete projection. He points out that 83% of the men traveling to marry women in places like the Philippines, Colombia, or Malta aren't looking for a maid. They are looking for contractual sanity.
They're engaging in global geographic arbitrage. They go to Colombia because the Colombian legal system fundamentally respects prenuptial agreements. They go to Malta because Malta doesn't have California's draconian lifetime alimony laws.
Right. As Riker dark comically puts it, why fight over custody in a rigged court in Los Angeles when you can fight fairly in Tagalog? Geography is the ultimate prenup. It is a ruthless cost-benefit analysis written in the blood and bankruptcy of millions of betrayed American husbands.
Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground here today, tracing this from Gramsci to GPS spoofers. Let's move into the outro and try to summarize this entire field manual.
To summarize the sheer scale and intensity of Riker's worldview, he operates from a core, unshakable belief that the laws of thermodynamics and evolutionary biology dictate reality. His fundamental premise is that men, through their physical labor, risk-taking, and innovation, build and maintain civilizations.
But he argues that the current gynocentric system, by prioritizing bureaucratic welfare over intact marriages, by legally penalizing fatherhood, and by treating men purely as disposable economic utilities, is actively engineering its own societal collapse.
Right.
He believes a system that attacks its primary builders cannot physically sustain itself.
He believes the system is quite literally eating itself alive.
Exactly. When he looks at the 70 million global abortions since Roe, he doesn't see healthcare, he sees a demographic purge. When he looks at the Title IV matching funds, he doesn't see child welfare, he sees state-sponsored extortion. And he firmly believes that men waking up, recognizing the rigged game, and actively opting out is the only viable way to break the machine.
It is a dark, intense, and incredibly detailed worldview that challenges every assumption of modern progressive sociology. And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, something to chew on that builds on Riker's material but looks toward the horizon, beyond just the family courts.
If Riker's right about the macroeconomic trends, if millions of young men are truly engaging in a coordinated silent marriage strike and a reproductive strike via offshore banking, privacy crypto, cash-only vasectomies, and mass expatriation, What does the geopolitical and economic landscape of a Western country look like in 50 years?
Right. What happens when a massive critical percentage of a nation's male workforce successfully and permanently opts completely out of the traditional consumer and familial economy? If the entire state apparatus relies on taxing men's hyper-productive labor to fund the massive welfare and administrative systems, but the men decide to just stop playing the game, downshift their lives, and work part-time, does the state go bankrupt?
It's a huge unknown.
Does the tax base collapse? Does society fracture entirely when the mules realize they can just walk off the plantation?
It's a chilling economic thought experiment.
It really is.
Oh.
Now, as a final reminder to everyone listening, this has been an incredibly deep dive into the Tangled Web. To read these exact arguments, to check his historical footnotes on Gramsci and the 1996 Welfare Act, and to see the claims for yourself, you absolutely must go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy the ebook.
It is a dense, provocative read. But if you want to truly understand the intellectual underpinnings of the modern manosphere, it is essential primary source material.
Absolutely. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books and grab it. And you should also follow the author directly to see where his research goes next. You can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing writings.
We covered a monumental amount of complex history and legal theory today. Thank you for taking this journey with us and keeping an open, analytical mind.
Thank you so much for diving deep. Before you close out the app, please remember to hit the like button on this deep dive and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. We'll see you next time down in the muddy waters.